Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Mindshift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I'm doing something I've never ever done before in the 5 or so years I've been doing this podcast. I'm actually going to re-release an episode. This is one that I did with my sister Valerie in 2017. We had just come back from a major trip over to France and Belgium. We were doing a World War I battlefield tour, something I like to do every year, which of course has been interrupted by COVID, but we sat down and we had a conversation about our upbringing. We talked about growing up in a fundamentalist Christian home, and specifically, as I've come to see it now, it was a cult. We were raised in the Bill Gothard, at the time what was called IBYC, Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. It's now relabeled, rebranded as Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP. Now, Bill Gothard himself has been disgraced. He's been removed as the head of that organization several years ago amidst many, many allegations of sexual assault against multiple women dating back decades, really. He's never actually been held to account for any of it, but at least he's no longer head of the organization. However, they still use his materials. They still use all of his stuff. If you go on the IBLP website, you will find Bill Gothard's name, his teaching, his theology are all over that website. And in fact, they are a very pervasive organization. They're into homeschooling, the ATI movement, the Advanced Training Institute. They produce all sorts of curriculum that gets put out to homeschooling families all over the country. They are involved in prison ministry and public school ministries. They run orphanages in places like Ukraine, Romania, Russia. They've got all kinds of fingers and all kinds of pies all over the world, not just in America. So they are, I consider, a dangerous cult. So we're going to talk about the effects of the toxic theology of the Gothard system. My parents, they ran their marriage according to his principles. They tried to raise us kids according to his teachings. And we are going to talk about the effects that it had on us, and more specifically how it affected my sister Valerie. So we're going to hear that story just in a minute. This re-released episode, I just wanted to mention, there's some really cool stuff coming up in the pipeline. We have an episode coming up with Dr. Josie McSkimming from Sydney, Australia. I talked to her just a week or so ago. She's actually a returning guest. I had her on the show several years ago. Kind of like old home week around here, isn't it? But this is a great conversation with Josie. We talked about a little bit about her backstory growing up in fundamentalist Christianity, how she got out, and really getting into this issue of rebuilding and reconstructing your life post-religion. How do you do it? So look for that episode coming up here in a couple of weeks with Dr. Josie McSkimming. And then after that, we've got another guest, another returning guest coming back. I told you it was old home week around here. We've got David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. I had just an amazing conversation with David just the other day. This is so good. We talked about deconstruction. We talked about our journey both as ex-evangelical pastors and what it's like to rebuild our life. And I really had a lot of questions for him about his cartoons. And so we got into a really excellent discussion about the content, the themes that we see running through a lot of his stuff. So that is just an excellent conversation with David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, coming up as well. Now, after this episode with Val, I listened to this again on the way to work just this morning, and I've got some reflections to make, so stick around after I'm done, because I've got a few things that I wanted to share with you. All right, let's get on into this re-release episode. Me and my sister Valerie Haycock Cunningham, we're going to talk about our backstory growing up in the Bill Gothard cult. What was it like? What sort of effect did it have on us as kids and then later as adults? So let's go on into surviving a fundamentalist upbringing. I hope you enjoy this re-release episode here on Mindshift Podcast. I am excited to be sitting here today with my sister Valerie. Do you want to say hello to everybody?
Hey.
That's my sister Valerie. She's been here with her husband Mike for a couple of weeks, and then we sent him home, didn't we?
Yep.
We sent him packing, and we went on an epic World War I journey. Yes. We went across the channel to France. We went all the way to Verdun and worked our way up through the Somme region and ended up in Belgium. That was an epic trip. We just got back a couple of days ago. And before Valerie, I should say, before Valerie leaves tomorrow, you're heading out tomorrow.
Yes, I am.
Flying back to Seattle to be with her husband and her dog.
Yes.
Fergus, you miss your dog more than your husband at this point?
No.
It's a toss-up.
It's a toss-up.
They have a new little dog called Fergus, and she misses him. I guess you miss your husband too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll give Mike a chance.
And my kids and my grandkids.
Oh, yeah. But we wanted to talk about this issue because this podcast is called Mind Shift. Used to be called the Preacher's Forum Podcast, but I realized that title was too restrictive. People thought it was all about preaching. And so I've changed it to Mind Shift, and we did a lot of talking. We've been talking over the years about our upbringing, and it's a pretty messed up story.
Oh, yeah.
Even though I won't say our ages, but we're mature now.
Yes.
We're mature.
Finally,
yeah. Well, some would argue that. I don't know. But we have a lot of stuff that we came out of as children. And, okay, we will say, how much older are you than me? We won't name names or ages, but...
I'm 9 years older.
Okay, so Valerie's 9 years older than me, and we came out of a very fundamentalist upbringing with some parents that were trying to live according to, some of Bill Gothard's teachings, and they were heavily into that, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But I think this podcast is aimed at people who either came out of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, or who are just wanting to know more about some of the toxic teaching and theology, how it affects people, isn't it?
Right.
And the mind shift part of it is how you come out of that on the other side.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people that they're still trapped in it, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And they are struggling with mental health issues and so many other problems as a result of being raised in such a toxic environment.
Oh, yeah.
So, both Valerie and I were raised in the Seattle, Washington area. And it's interesting because we were just talking before we started recording this about the difference in our upbringing. What would you say? Because the fact that you're 9 years older than me, you had a 9-year window where things were different, weren't they?
Yes.
Before I was born. I was the last child of 5 older sisters. What was the difference between those 9 years, would you say, and then when I came along? Well, everything was ruined then when I came along.
No, it wasn't anything you did, obviously.
Oh, good.
But when I was 3, your father married my mother, and so we had a separate life before they got married, our mother and my older sister and me. And we weren't a part of any church. We didn't go to any church, really. Once in a while, we would visit the church that our grandparents were at. And my grandfather would preach there once in a while.
Yeah, they were Friends or Quakers, weren't they?
Yeah, Quaker background. And we would visit there once in a while. But I don't ever remember being involved in any church on a regular basis until after my mom married your dad, who's my stepfather. And that's a whole other story.
It's a very strange story because Valerie and I are technically half brother, half sister. We have the same mother, but Valerie's father is my father's brother.
Older brother, yes.
So my mom was married to your dad, and we had Valerie and Jeanette, our oldest two sisters. And then he left. They got a divorce. Then my mom married my dad, who was his brother.
Yes, younger brother.
Already it's a Jerry Springer show. Yeah. Unbelievable. You literally couldn't make this stuff up.
Well, a lot of that, too, was the fact that our grandparents, pressured the other 2 remaining brothers that one of them really needed to marry our mom, according to Old Testament, how they did it in the Old Testament, which harkens back to their Quaker background. And they said, one of you needs to step up and marry her and take care of the 2 children. and she ended up marrying your dad, and they were married in 1960. I would have been 3, and we started going to church fairly quickly after they got married. We would go to Sunday school and maybe visit here and there. Never really found a church that they really liked. And we had our next sister born. She's 4 years younger than I am. And then the next sister was born. And then the house we were living in at the time in Seattle was too small. So we moved to Kent, and we started going to a church. I was around 5, a local church that was just barely getting off the ground, starting.
Right. So
it had been going, yeah, they had planted it, and wonderful, wonderful pastor. I just really love that guy. So I was used to a very loving church. We all took care of each other. It was a very close-knit church. Us kids grew up together. That's where I accepted Christ, and prayed the prayer, the magic prayer,
the sinner's prayer.
The sinner's prayer. I got baptized. My stepfather baptized me, and I started that church when I was about 5. So I grew up every year going through Sunday school, junior high, and high school youth group, and we were all really close. And it was such a family feeling. And then when I was about 11 or 12, we had a great family at home, very loving. My parents got along really well. Us kids were all really close. Eventually, our younger sister was born, and then you, Clint, were born. And we were all very close-knit and very happy family. Then in about, I'm not sure when, 68, 69, somewhere in there, 1968, 69, the church got involved in the Bill Gothard Basic Youth Conflict Seminars. And a lot of the people started going to this, and it completely changed my life.
And not for the better.
Not for the better. It was horrible. And we went from a carefree, happy, full of laughter family to children filled with fear. Our parents went completely overboard on what they called discipline. It was really physical abuse.
Yeah, it's more like child abuse.
It was child abuse, abused all of us children. And I didn't know what to think or how to act, because here I'd been a carefree child up till about the age of 11, 12, 13, and suddenly I'm told that I'm stupid, I don't have a mind, why aren't you doing better, you're being disrespectful, you're ugly, all these terrible things. I'm getting beat practically every day for the smallest infractions. If she didn't like, if a mom didn't like the look you gave her, she'd just slap you, or pull your hair, jerk you around by your hair. Another thing they do is they would beat us with pieces of kindling, of wood, and would beat us for, I don't know, seemed like forever, 10, 15 minutes. And it was just a horrible, it was such a change that my reaction was I completely rebelled. And I would get into big fights with them. I didn't care what they thought of me. I stood up for myself and said, I don't like how you're treating me. You need to stop treating me. But then that would bring on more beatings.
Yeah, because you're the rebellious child.
Exactly. And God didn't want a rebellious child. They needed to break my will. I wasn't under their authority, air quotes.
The famous umbrella of authority.
Yes, the famous umbrella. And supposedly my stepdad was supposed to be this giant umbrella of protection over us. And if supposedly through the Bill Gothard teaching, if he had any holes or sin in his life, then Satan could get to us children or we could take ourselves out of this umbrella, from under this umbrella, and that's what I got told I was doing, that I'd pulled myself out of this umbrella of his protection, and therefore Satan was attacking me, and I wasn't under God's authority, I wasn't under their authority, and I was a kid. I didn't know what any of this meant, but it was whatever I was doing apparently was wrong.
Yeah, you were getting spanked for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what would you say accounted for that change? Why was such? I mean, yes, we have the Bill Gothard theology, which is a whole nother subject. I mean, and now it's come out that Bill Gothard's been accused of sexual abuse and all sorts of things, and his teaching is, when you look at it now, it's unbelievably bizarre and strange theology that he's come out with. But this idea of spanking the child till you break their will,
yes.
You've succeeded when they start crying. That's apparently when you've reached that point, and you can stop spanking them. So if you have a child who's rebellious, then they need to have their will broken even more.
Yes.
And I grew up in that environment knowing only that.
Yeah.
So I received thousands and thousands of spankings, sometimes 2 and 3 spankings a day with my sister.
Yeah.
We were in trouble all the time. So it clearly wasn't working.
But you were just being children. You were just being kids.
We were just being naughty
kids. It wasn't
kids.
that you were planning, okay, I need to get 15 spankings today. What can I do
to earn
those 15 spankings? Because I want to be under God's authority and under Dad and Mom's authority. It wasn't anything like that. We were just being kids. And there was no nurturing. There was no praise, because Bill Gothard taught that if you praise your children, you'll make them vain.
Of course you will.
Here I'm, going into junior high. I want to look nice for school. And at one point, my stepfather said, I'm going to take the mirrors down in the bathroom because you girls are getting too vain. So we don't want that. God doesn't want vanity in your life. And we said, no, you can't do that, please. We need at least a mirror. And so we actually won one battle, and he left the mirrors up. But I think a lot of it, too, a big part was, and this just kind of struck me the other day, was the fact that our mom is very strong-minded. And she is a leader type of personality. She has a one-track mind. She wants to be in charge.
Very focused.
And extremely focused. And so she was able to do that. Her personality did fine with that before the Bill Gothard thing as kind of the leader in the marriage, because our dad was more laid back and he was kind of chill, and he just let her do it. And they were playing their roles correctly.
It seemed to work.
It worked fine for the first 10 years of their marriage or so. And then once they went to the Bill Gothard, she was told, no. You need to come under his authority. He needs to be the spiritual leader in the marriage. But he wasn't that. That wasn't his personality. And so they started clashing. She started clashing with us, and she would say, to him, hey, do something about this child. She's not respecting my authority. You need to spank her. And he's coming home from work just going, what? I have to spank her. I don't know anything about it. I read an excerpt in his diary just a few years ago. It said, this is from when I was a teenager. It said, had to spank Val again today because she got caught talking to a boy on the phone.
Oh, you're a terrible person,
I was
Val.
a teenage girl
Isn't that what girls do?
Junior high and high school. But apparently I got spanked for talking to a boy on the phone. And so when I was about 15, 16, somewhere in there, then I wanted to start dating. But they would not let me date anyone except for someone from either our church, a Church of Christ, or an affiliate church, another Church of Christ. So I'd try to pick out these different guys. I wasn't really interested in any of them. It was a little bit enough to say, yeah, if this is the only way I can date, so be it. Okay, so I'll go out with so-and-so.
Take one of those nerdy Christian boys.
Yeah.
Better than nothing, I guess.
And they weren't any better than the non-Christian boys, because a lot of them were hands all over. But so that was the only time I could date, and I had to bring the boy home to the house. They interviewed him to find out, is he a Christian? What does his parents do? Where does his dad work? Are your parents Christians? What church do you go to? Have you been baptized? Have you accepted the Lord? I mean, they would do this big interview.
The Spanish
and of course,
Inquisition.
that was, And of course, a lot of times that was the end of that boy. He just like, I'm out of here. This is ridiculous.
He wasn't polishing a shotgun.
Yeah. So when I was 16, I started dating a boy from school behind their back.
And he wasn't a Christian?
He was not a Christian. He did not come from a Christian home. And I knew that if they caught me, that I would get beat.
Big trouble.
So I dated him behind their backs. I would say, well, I'm going to go and meet a girlfriend. We're going to go to a football game or whatever. But instead, he and I would go to the movies. And we would date behind their backs. And this went on for quite some time until the summer I was 17, I discovered that I might be pregnant. I didn't know because I had no idea. I had never been told the facts of life. I had no clue. And so I knew there was something physically wrong with me. At first I thought I was dying, that I might have cancer. I was petrified. My body's changing. It's doing these weird things. And so I spent that summer, and my tummy's getting bigger and bigger. And I think, well, okay, I'll cut back on my food. Maybe I'll lose some weight. And it never dawned on me until one time our family had gone camping, and I was wearing a swimsuit. And my mother looked at me, and she's like, what's going on? So they took me aside as soon as we got home and said, are you pregnant? And that was like an epiphany to me. I was like, oh, maybe I am.
That's what's wrong with me.
That's what's wrong with me. And they said, lay across the bed, and they spanked me for getting pregnant at 16 years old.
Because that'll solve the problem.
Yeah.
It's too late then.
He spanked me with a piece of kindling wood. And it didn't make me unpregnant.
No.
But he got the message across, apparently, that I had disobeyed him. I had ruined their lives. Their first reaction was, how could you do this to us?
Yeah, so
that's what they said. How could you do this to us? And I said, I didn't even know I could get pregnant. I didn't know anything about that.
And of course, the irony of the whole thing, there's so many ironies, isn't there, that if they had given you the parental guidance, maybe you would have avoided getting pregnant, but you didn't even know that having sex could lead you to getting pregnant.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
A lot of the blame falls back on them, but of course they're spanking you.
Yes.
It's all your fault.
Yeah.
They accept no responsibility.
Yeah.
It's all about them.
Yeah.
Because I can remember I'm about 9 or so at this stage when Valerie got pregnant. And I can remember our dad was an elder at the church that we attended, this Church of Christ. And he got up and gave a big speech about how he had to resign as an elder. And he said, the reason I have to step down is because the Bible says that if you're an elder and you can't shepherd the church and the flock of God, you can't be an elder if you can't manage your family. And so he, again, made it all about him. And everybody came up to him and they were like, oh, brother, we're so sorry. Your daughter's so rebellious. And, please don't step down. No, it's what the Bible says, and I need to do that. And so he got all this sympathy and all this support. My parents did, and so, again, they made it all about themselves and how it made them look, your actions embarrassed them and everything.
Yeah, and they what they were doing with me is they said, you can't live here at home anymore. We will go through the Bill Gothard. They had like a counseling service, which also did an adoption service.
And ironically, the name of that service
burden bearers.
Was called burden bearers. Now,
Yes.
whose burden were they bearing?
Yes.
Certainly wasn't yours.
It wasn't mine. It was
It
not
eased
mine.
their burden
Yes.
because they were able to shove you out of the house
Yes.
and closet you away, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah, they sent me away probably 75 miles away to a foster home that took in unwed mothers. And I went and lived there. I moved into that place in November. I was still 17 at the time. And because I was 17, I legally couldn't make any decisions. So our parents made all the decisions on that I was going to give up the child for adoption. They just shoved papers in front of my face and said, here, sign this. The only input I had in the whole thing was I said, I want to have my child go to a family that couldn't have children, and I wanted the child to go to a Christian home, a loving Christian home, which she ended up going to, which is wonderful. So, but that was the only input I had. And then the birth father also had to sign some documents, and that was it. I didn't know what the documents were. They put me on welfare. It paid for my medical, for all the prenatal stuff, and then I got $100 stipend to live off. But yet the foster home charged me $90 a month for rent. And so I had to pay, that was for my room and board. So I lived off $10 a month. I enrolled myself in high school there in this other city. And so I was able to go to high school from November to January until I got so pregnant that I couldn't literally fit into a student desk. And I had to drop out right then in the semester. And I was 18, so I could legally take myself out of school. And so I continued to live in the foster home. I basically had the clothes on my back. I was not allowed to bring anything other than a small suitcase. Whatever I was told I could put into that suitcase, that's what I could take to this foster home, which was really nothing. It was more like an overnight case and toiletries. So at one point, my best girlfriend's stepmother took me shopping because she realized that I didn't have any maternity clothes even. And so she took me to charity shops and bought me some clothes. And I was told by our parents that I could not have any contact with any of my siblings. And being the second oldest, I was really close with all of my siblings. I was kind of like the captain of the ship. I was their protector. I at times would try to break up my mother beating one of my younger siblings. I actually jumped on her back one time to stop her from beating one of my sisters. And that was my role. I was the protector. I was the captain of these siblings. And here I'm suddenly just yanked out of that, told not to have any contact. I couldn't call you guys. I couldn't have any kind of contact. And because they looked at me like I was a sinful, rebellious person full of poison, and that I might infect my other siblings with this satanic boil that was bursting or something. I don't know what they were thinking. But so I couldn't have any contact. I got to come home at Christmas time one time, and I think I was just there overnight, and then they took me right back the next day after Christmas back to the foster home. I had no friends in the city that I lived in, because when I was in high school there and I was pregnant, because of the timing, mid to late 70s, if you were pregnant and not married back then, you were a pariah in society. And I was treated by the other students like I had some kind of communicable disease. And they didn't talk to me. I sat alone in the lunchroom. Even in the classroom, I'd go and sit in a desk, and nobody would sit by me. It would be the last two desks, the last two students that came in that room had to sit by me. And
they had no choice.
They had no choice. And I just finished what schooling I could, and not getting to be able to graduate. I was short a couple of credits, but I just had to quit school. I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, you had no choice.
Yeah.
So on top of the trauma of being rejected by your parents, being forced to live in another city miles away from your family, your friends, you've got no support.
No, none.
Because I remember we visited you one time, I think, while you were living in that foster home, and it was only to drop off a few things that you needed.
Right.
It wasn't a long visit. We saw your room, and then we were out of there.
Yeah.
So I'm 9-10 years old, and I'm missing my sister, wondering how she's doing, because we couldn't call you, we couldn't talk on the phone.
No.
And so we see you for maybe half an hour or less, and we're on the road again, going back home. So our parents did a good job of keeping the family, the siblings, apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were afraid you were going to infect us all.
And you and I had a conversation many, many years ago about this, and you shared with me how you were feeling when I suddenly left. That, repeat that.
Well, I'm 9 years old, and I can remember going back to before you got put in the foster home. Our parents would have these big family meetings, and Valerie and I were super close, even though there was 9 years apart. I remember you used to teach me how to draw and things like that. When I was a kid, I was interested in art and things, and we were really close. And my parents had these big, with all of us sitting in this room, in the living room.
Yeah.
And they were basically like announcing, well, Val's pregnant and she's done a terrible thing. And there were these huge fights and screaming. And all of us kids are sitting around the perimeter of the room watching our parents that we love, with our sister that we love, screaming at each other. And we don't know whose side to take. We don't know. It's a total chaotic environment. And then suddenly you're just gone. And
no explanation.
No real explanation. We put Val in a foster home. She's going to have her baby, and that was it.
Yeah.
And you were done, and it was just like almost as if you died and just had been, cut out of our lives without really any closure at all.
Yeah.
And we see you one or two times, maybe in the span of the time that you're pregnant, and then. I'm 9-10 years old. I don't have a car. I can't drive. I can't.
Yeah.
So. It's very damaging for sure to see all this and have no way to process that. As a 9-year-old boy, and all my sisters are just sitting there with our jaws on the floor watching all this, the family literally tear itself apart. And I keep coming back to this thing of we're supposedly a Christian family. We're a church-going family. My dad's an elder.
Yes.
He's highly respected. He was very heavily involved in the Bill Gothard. He was chairman of the host and hostesses committee. He was not just a regular attendee. They were involved in leadership. They used to go on retreats. He led worship in the church. He played piano. He was in a country gospel band. Him and our mom were in a country gospel quartet. They did gigs all around, so... They were real good Christians. And yet the family life that nobody else saw but us was horrific.
It was a nightmare because we would get Sunday mornings. It was an absolute terrifying morning because our mother's freaking out. She's screaming at us, yelling at us, smacking us around. Get ready for church. Get ready for church. Get ready for church.
The ultimate irony.
We'd get in the car. She'd be screaming, yelling at us all the way to church. We'd get out of the car, and she'd say something like, you guys better behave. We would file in, and our family, all 8 of us, 6 children and our parents, sat in the front row.
We had our
Here
pew.
we are. That was the Haycock pew. This is where you guys sit, and you better act perfectly.
Put on the plastic smile.
Yes, put on the plastic smile. And we're dressed nice. Our hair is combed. Luckily, we had a mirror still.
You did have a mirror.
And we were this perfect family, perfect Christian family. But yet, the minute we got back in the car, the hair pulling started, the slapping started, all the way home, scream and yell. And I remember one instance we were getting ready for church, and my little sister, was carrying a bowl of Jell-O for a potluck after church. And she was walking towards the car. We're getting ready to go to church. And she tripped. and dropped this bowl of Jell-O onto the concrete sidewalk. And our mother flew into a rage. And how dare you, clumsy, stupid, idiot child? What do you think you're doing? And it was just, she tripped.
Just a kid.
You know?
It happens.
Just a little, she was like
happen.
8 or 9 when that happened. And, you know, well, what are we going to bring to church potluck now? You know, I was like, oh my goodness, the world didn't just end. You know, but that's, yeah, but at church, oh, we were the perfect family. But at home, our life was an absolute nightmare. We were terrified of our mother. We never knew when she was going to strike out at us, either verbally, emotionally, physically. We had no idea. And we just felt like we were constantly on eggshells. As a matter of fact, I can remember up until I was probably 55, 56 years old, I was still afraid of her. And I talked to my other sisters, and they were still afraid of her in our 50s.
Yeah, grown, married, have families,
yeah, still
long
afraid
since
of
left
her.
the house.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so much more going on in that picture, because going back to the time when you're living in the foster home, you're pregnant, you haven't had your baby yet. You know, as I was saying, we're living in this toxic environment. We'd grown up in it. And about that time, I was 9 or 10, my mom started coming to me, because we always had kind of a special relationship where we could talk. And she started unloading on me all this terrible stuff about our dad, about how he was such a terrible father and a terrible husband, and he wasn't a spiritual leader, and he wasn't the head of the household, and, you know, I wish he'd just do a Bible study with our family, and why doesn't he do more, and everything. And that's got to go back to what you talked about with the Bill Gothard theology. The man must be the head of the house.
Yes.
So she kind of was the head of the house before they started going.
Right.
Their roles switched, and he couldn't or wouldn't live up to that perfect ideal.
Yes.
And so I learned when I was in counseling in college that this is called emotional incest. This is what they call triangulation or emotional incest, where a parent unloads on a child, their frustrations about their partner, and it's incredibly damaging, incredibly inappropriate, you know. And what it succeeded in doing, because me and my dad were really close, I was his little buddy, because he'd had all these girls, no disrespect to girls, but they were waiting for a boy to come along, and I was named the same name as my dad. They named me the same name as him, and we were little buddies. Every time he wanted to go to the store, you know, oh, you want to come with me? Yeah, let's go. And we'd play and wrestle around, and we were pretty close. And I think my mom was jealous of that closeness, and part of the emotional incest was a way to drive a wedge in between me and my father, and it succeeded, because I started to have a lot of contempt for him, and I started looking at him and thinking, you know, you're treating our mother horribly. You're a jerk. You're not even a good husband. You're not a good father. And when I was 13, I came home from summer camp. I'd had a terrible week of summer camp, Christian summer camp, where I'd gone and I didn't have any friends. All my friends went to a different camp earlier in the summer, and I couldn't go because I think we were on vacation at that time. So I went another week, and I didn't know anybody. I was alone the whole week. And I came home. I'd had a terrible week, and it was one of the worst weeks of my life. I walked in the door on the Saturday, having, you know, driven home with my friends or from the church. The first thing my dad said was, "Go mow the lawn." And he'd let it go for a week, and it was then like a foot high, and we got into a big argument, and our relationship that day was forever severed. You know, all my frustrations and pent-up anger about all the stuff that had gone on with you and what my mom had poisoned me against him for the rest of his life. He died, 4 or 5 years ago?
I think so.
I mean, we obviously had a communicating relationship. We could talk and stuff, but we were never close. Our relationship was destroyed. And my mom does play a big part in bringing that about. And so you've got all these things going on, you know, while you're pregnant.
Yeah, yep.
So you want to go back to when, okay, you're in this foster home. Let's pick up the story there. What happened when you had your daughter then?
So what happened then, I went into labor really early in the hours. I went to the hospital. They knew that she was going up for adoption. And so I had her, but I passed out. I completely passed out. And I didn't wake up. I heard her cry, and I passed out. And I didn't wake up for several hours later, and I was on a complete different floor. They wouldn't even put me on the same floor as the other women who had had children. I was on a completely different floor and completely isolated. And they did not want me going anywhere near the nursery. They told me, you will not go to the nursery. You will not see your child. You had a girl, and they gave me some other paperwork to sign. I'm just barely waking up. I'm still kind of groggy. And they're saying, here, sign this paperwork so that you can be released from the hospital. And so I signed it. I don't even know what it was. My then boyfriend, her birth father, came to the hospital. He had to sign the documents too. So I'm assuming they were giving up our right to being parents.
And you're releasing your
parental
rights.
Right. So I signed the documents and got out of the hospital the next day. My boyfriend at the time took me back to the foster home because I had belongings there that I wanted to get. So I gathered all those up, told those people goodbye, because they had treated me really bad. They were a supposedly Christian home,
of course,
but they treated me like I was an indentured servant. I did all the cleaning, even though I was heavily pregnant. I cleaned the house. They had a 2-story house. I cleaned upstairs and downstairs. I babysat their children. They had 2 toddlers. I babysat their children for them. I helped cook. I helped clean.
So it's a pretty sweet gig for them.
It was, completely. Plus, I had to pay rent.
Oh, of course.
$90 a month.
Well, the burden bearers.
Yes. I don't know who's...
their burdens,
yeah,
too.
I bore their... I had nothing. I was destitute.
Have to cook, clean.
Yeah, I was completely
you were
destitute.
paying for the privilege of
doing it, yeah.
living in this terrible foster home.
Yeah. So, anyway,
Crazy.
so my boyfriend took me to his house, and I called our parents and I said, I'm home. I've, given up the baby. Can I come home? And they said, absolutely not. You are not welcome in our home ever again. 18 years old.
Right.
I had turned 18 in November, and that was in March. And I had nothing. I had that little suitcase. I had some belongings in there. I said, I don't know what to do. And I didn't want to stay with them, with my boyfriend's family, because at the time his mother had cancer. And she was really sick. So I called my best friend's mom, and I'm in just tears. I'm just bawling, and I say,
where am I going to go?
I don't know where to go. I have nothing. I have no money. My parents will not let me come back home. I can't see any of my siblings still. I couldn't even see my pastor. They wouldn't even let me do counseling with the pastor that I had been raised with. And they didn't want anybody in the church, knowing where I was. I had no contact with anybody. And so when I talked to my best girlfriend's mom, she said, you get over here right now. You can move in with us. And they lived in this little tiny house. There was, 4 or 5 of them at the time living in this little house, this little 3-bedroom house. And she's like, you get over here right now, Val, and you can live with us. And so she ended up taking me in. She was really the mother that I really needed. And she was a wonderful woman. I loved her immensely, and she loved me immensely. But she took me in. She got me a job right away. Helped me go and get on my feet finally, and I was able to eventually, once I got on my feet again, I could go to her. But I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but I didn't know it.
Depression as
postpartum.
Yeah,
and I can remember just
all the trauma of having lived through the last year.
Yes. Oh, it was horrible, absolutely horrible.
It's indescribable, really.
And I was not getting any kind of counseling at all. And remember shortly after I moved in with my best friend's family, I can remember going underneath a bush out in the yard and just screaming and screaming and screaming, I want my baby back. I want my baby back. And I had no idea. Later, years and years later, I found out that I had legally, in the state that we lived in, up to a year to get her back.
Right, so you could have
But
actually
I could have
her.
actually taken her back. But
Of course, they
I
didn't
had
tell you
no
that.
idea. No, I had no idea.
Sign these papers and
here,
whisk the
sign
baby
this.
away,
Yep,
and you
baby's
didn't
gone.
even get to see
Yep,
her.
Yep. And I also found out during the time that I was destitute that her adoptive parents, wonderful people, but they paid huge sum of money. I can't remember the figures, but it was over $10,000.
Was this our friends, the burden bearers?
Through the burden bearers.
Oh, there they are
got
again.
paid by the adoptive parents. It was somewhere between the figure, I want to say between $10,000 and $25,000 to be able to adopt my child.
Yeah, just crazy amounts of money.
Destitute, poor. I'm barely feeding myself bread and water. Literally, I ate bread and water. But yet this burden bearers, this Christian
in air quotes
group was getting all this money for me.
Yeah, what did they do to deserve $25,000 or
Shuffled
whatever
some
it was?
paperwork around, got
Yeah.
signatures. That's it. They never counseled me. They didn't ever bear my burden.
I was going to say, you had a lot of burdens that didn't get borne by anybody
Yes.
except yourself. You had to.
Myself. That was it. I only had myself.
I just cannot get over the fact that you have all these sort of layers. Parents that are Christians is another layer of all this story. You know, we're both parents. We have kids. I've got 2 daughters. You've got a son and a daughter. You know, I can't imagine just on a human level, as a parent, doing that to my own child.
Yeah.
Kicking them out and leaving them with nothing and no support. So how could you do that just as purely a parent?
Yeah.
And then somehow justify all this with what the Bible says
Yeah.
about loving other people and taking care of the needy and the helpless,
Yeah.
the widows, the orphans.
Yes.
What about those verses in the Bible
Yeah.
that were conveniently overlooked by our parents and the, quote, burden bearers? You know, I just don't understand any of that, you know. So
yeah, I was really, for this Christian group, burden bearers, I was treated as a commodity. I was just a number. I was just...
you were a prophet.
I was prophet for them.
I mean, here's a single
prophet.
Gal who's vulnerable. And they're taking advantage of you, and they made a lot of money.
Yes, they did.
By hooking your baby up with a family.
Yeah.
You know, it's just crazy to think
how
about
many
how
other?
this happens.
How many others were there?
Thousands. There
I'm
must have
sure. Yeah, very lucrative business.
Yeah.
I was just a commodity, and I know that her adoptive parents had tried to adopt other children prior to her, and for some reason or other, it fell through. But they adopted her. You know, years later, I was reunited with my daughter, and I find out that she just had a wonderful life. She says she was spoiled rotten, and I couldn't have asked for more.
And you couldn't have provided that in the state you were in.
No, I could not have. And it did turn out that it was a good thing for her because I tried to get away from that boyfriend, and he beat me up several times really badly. I didn't end up in the hospital, but I tried to go to my family for help. They said, nope, sorry. You made your bed now. You get to lie in it. Too bad for you. And he would stalk me, and I just kept having to move and hide from him. And the last straw was he on the phone threatened suicide. And I was at the point I said, fine, go ahead. I'm waiting. And then that was the last time I ever heard from him. So, but all through those years, I wasn't receiving any kind of therapy or counseling. I was still trying to please my parents somehow, anything I could do, you know, something that I'm doing. I've got my life together. I'm working. I have a nice apartment. You know, I was saving money. I had money in the bank. They still wasn't good enough. Nothing I could do was ever good enough. And so then I spent the next 40 years trying to please, especially my mother, probably because it's, that's my mother. I want to make her happy, but I could never make her happy. I know when I had my daughter with my husband, they didn't even go to the hospital. They didn't even go to the hospital when she was born. And a couple of weeks later, I waited and waited. Nothing, no calls, nothing. Finally, I called him, and I was like, hey, Dad answered the phone. I said, hey, are you going to come and see your granddaughter? Well, we've been busy and da-da-da, and we just haven't had time, da-da-da. And I said, I have a wonderful husband, beautiful house. I have a beautiful daughter. And I said, what is it going to take for you guys to love me and accept me? What do I have to do for you guys? This isn't good enough? I don't know what to do.
What else can I do?
Yeah. And I think it was a couple days later they finally came and saw her. She was almost 3 weeks old.
Having a granddaughter and not being at the hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, when we had our first daughter, everybody came down because we were living in Portland and Oregon at the time, and they all drove down from Seattle, and it was a big, exciting thing. But you'd want to be there. I'd want to be there if it was my daughter.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that. Now, getting on this subject of mind shift, we talked about this before. We said, okay, the name of the podcast is Mind Shift. It's about having these mind shifts and changing the way you think about things. Because this is going back a long time, these stories we're telling.
Right.
But there's another layer to this whole story as well, and that is probably about, 5-6 years ago, it came out that our father was allegedly, he was addicted to pornography, and this was our mother made him confess, in air quotes. But then as the story became a little bit more pronounced, it comes out that he was basically a pedophile.
Yes.
And this is all through those years when we were in church, when he was an elder, a worship leader. Yes. We don't even know the extent of the things he did. No. But we certainly know that he abused you and our other sister when you were little girls.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the sad truth is that our mother ended up siding with him.
Yes.
And turned against all of us, some of us children who were trying to figure out what our father had done.
Yes.
And he took his secrets with him to the grave.
Yeah.
Even though you confronted him, didn't you? And I confronted him before he died and asked him to tell the truth about what he had done, and he refused.
Yeah.
And he died a few years ago, allegedly as a Christian, and I told him, I said, you call yourself a Christian, then that means you believe that when you die, you're going to be standing before God.
Right.
And he's going to say to you, you had a chance to clear the slate, to ask for forgiveness of the people you hurt. I said, do you want to be in that position? And I said, you've got a chance now before you die to get this all off your chest and tell everybody what you've done. And he didn't. He wouldn't.
No.
And the most freeing thing for me, the mind shift for me, and I think maybe for you as well, was we had to end up cutting my mother and some of our siblings completely out of our lives.
Yes.
And that was the most freeing thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
My life has radically changed for the better since I made that decision. I don't know what you
I ended up, when this all came out with him, I ended up going back to therapy. And I've had to do therapy almost always, off and on through my entire adult life because of the messed up childhood that we had. And so I was going to therapy, and the therapist suggested that I physically take something, and what she suggested is take a rock, write on it your feelings, your emotions in felt pen, and then bury it. Well, I happen to live on a lake, so I thought, aha. So I took one rock that represented my mother, one rock that represented my stepfather, and I just wrote all over my emotions, like things like anger, bitterness, fear, loathing, hatred, and I just wrote all these words.
Must have been a pretty big rock.
It was. They were both very large rocks.
Boulders, really?
Very, yeah. So like 1 ton boulder.
They're not pebbles
yeah,
we're talking about.
No.
Couldn't fit all the stuff on a pebble.
Yeah. So I did that, and I wrote these words, all these feelings that I felt that I was getting from them, and that I wanted to get rid of out of my life, because I never felt like they loved me or cared about me. or even respected me. I was a respected person in my community. I'd raised 2 beautiful children. I reunited with my adopted daughter. We have a great relationship. I was a successful person, and I still could never measure up. So I did these rocks, and I had my husband film me, and I went down to the lake, and I threw them in, and I threw them as far as I could, and it was just like this huge 1-ton boulder off of my heart. And it was so freeing because I cut them both completely out of my life. And before I had suffered debilitating depression, I had been on antidepressants off and on through the years. I had so many so much therapy, counseling. My poor husband, he's so dedicated to me, and I couldn't be where I am today without his help as well. And he wasn't raised in a Christian family. His family wasn't even a Christian family.
But
they're
they
the ones
took
that
more care of you than our own family.
Yes,
and they weren't even Christians.
They're the ones that took me in. My best friend's mother, her family, and then I ended up marrying my best friend's brother 35 years later, and wonderful marriage and great life. I just wouldn't trade it for anything. But all that the feelings of inferiority and guilt and anxiety was gone. That minute I threw those rocks into the lake, cut those people out of my life, I'm done. It's over. And what a freedom. I could almost feel myself grow emotionally and mentally. It was like, wow, I got out of prison. I feel like I got out of prison.
Stepping into the light for the first time.
Yeah. And I'd gone to so many different churches looking for the answer. Where's this loving God, this nurturing God? I don't see it. The Christians that are going to my church are horrible people. They're treating me bad too. We finally left the church. We said, that's it, we're done. We're getting treated worse by these so-called Christians than we were any non-Christian friends. We're so much better.
Yes.
And finally we'd had it. We threw the towel in and quit going to church. And even that was really freeing. And I since have found God when I hike. I find God up in the mountains or in the woods. And that's where I communicate with my God. And that's the loving and nurturing God that I found outside the church, outside my Christian family. What a difference.
And the truth is, we need community, though. That's the sad truth, isn't it? Is that it's supposed to be in church, places like church. Mm-hmm. And for some people, I guess it is. I'm not just here to bash on the church, but in both of our experiences, I think we share the same frustration of we just wanted to serve churches. We wanted to use our gifts.
Yep.
And time again, there's politics and all those people treating us horribly and all this. And finally, Lisa and I, my wife and I, walked away. And you guys walked away, and that's a sad thing, but it had to be done. So, cutting certain members out of our family, they're just too toxic. As we wrap it up, I'd be curious, what would you say? What would be your advice to someone who's in a similar situation? You can imagine, let's say, a young girl, a young woman who's in the situation as yours, pregnant, not knowing what she's supposed to do. What advice could you give for someone in that scenario?
What I would say is find like-minded people that are going to support you and love you unconditionally.
Not
and
the
nurture
burden bearers.
You. Not burden bearers.
No.
But find you. That is the hardest time of your life. Whether you choose to keep the child, which is going to be a hardship, give the child up for adoption, which is a different kind of hardship, an abortion, which is a different kind of hardship. It's all, there's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. But I would say find a group. There's a lot of support groups out there. I just recently, within the last year, finally discovered a group for adoptees and birth parents. I just started going to the support group. It's once a month. Life-changing for me because I've always felt isolated. I never knew another birth parent, ever. So I had nobody to share the burdens that you carry, the guilt you carry. I mean, obviously today my adopted daughter has completely forgiven me, and she knows my whole story.
She knows the story.
Get the support you need. Find the support groups that are going to support you. Whatever path you choose, there is no right, there is no wrong, but you've got to find it. And I would say don't go to the church, because I tried doing therapy last year. I called a gal that was a therapist at a church, and her answer to me was, well, all the answers are in the Bible, what you need. And I said, well, I'm not finding that. I don't see anything about birth parents in the Bible. Well, I can't really counsel you, and I don't really know of any other Christian counselors that can even help you. And I said, fine, thank you for your time. And I hung up. So even today, I still can't find the support through the church that I need.
It's true, isn't it? This is something Steve Austin and I talked about on our podcast a few months ago, was that churches are just not equipped in so many cases to handle mental health issues and things like that, counseling. At best, they might be able to refer you to a network at best, hopefully.
Yeah.
But the other thing I've found a lot of help in healing, I mentioned this before, is the ex-evangelical group on Facebook.
Yes.
And I know you're toying with joining. You should join the group, because if it's a supportive community, and you hear those stories and you go, that's me.
Yeah.
We were raised without a television. We were raised not being allowed to listen to secular music. We were raised in a stifling fundamentalist environment, and so many other people not only were, but they've come out of that, and they're finding this freedom that we found. Us out from underneath the burdens. We keep using that word.
Yeah.
But that community helps us bear the burdens. I'll steal their phrase and use it on them.
Well, I think they're defunct now anyway, so it's okay.
It's a shame, really, that the burden bearers are gone, and Bill Gothard's sort of in disgrace, but he's still fighting to try to clear his name and everything.
Ludicrous.
But I was going to say, right at the very end, if people wanted to get a hold of you, Valerie, is there a way that someone can find you on social media, or
just contact you, and you can contact me, and then I'm happy to talk to anybody. I've got so much experience under my belt that I
maybe
would love
that's
to
the
help
best
people.
way to start. If someone had listened to this podcast and said, I need to talk to Valerie, contact me and I'll put you in touch with her, and then you can kind of go from there. We've had people contact us before, and I put them in touch with my wife, Lisa, who were going through similar things when she shared her abortion story. So, there are people out there listening that this story will impact and it will touch. So thank you very much, Valerie Haycock Cunningham.
Yes.
I will say that's your maiden name, for being a part of this podcast and just being willing and vulnerable to share your story.
Yeah, thank you.
I know it's a powerful story.
Yeah,
And
still
there's more
emotional.
life ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to mention a couple things at the back end of the show. I don't know about you, but I was absolutely brought to tears. I said before that I listened to this show this morning on the way to work. I wanted to hear it again before I released it, and I was absolutely brought to tears when I heard Valerie describing how after she'd been forced to give up her baby for adoption by this quote-unquote Christian adoption agency alongside my parents, how she crawled under a bush and was screaming and crying that I want my baby back. And I was literally brought to tears on the road as I was driving to work, because I remembered so powerfully living through all those experiences, which I shared a little bit in this show. And a lot of things have changed for me too in my private life. I mentioned in the episode that I talked about my wife Lisa. Well, we are now divorced. That's a big change in my life too, and it's a new chapter kind of opening up for both of us. So again, big changes, all part of the journey though, isn't it? Processing and all the rest of it. And I talked about at the time, I had just changed the name of the podcast to the Mind Shift Podcast, and that was a big change for me. And I guess this podcast is my journey too. It's charting my own deconstruction as well as reconstruction. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's not really, it's something that's, I guess, enjoyable, but it's certainly thought-provoking. It just made me think, my God, I mean, how could Christians do that to their own daughter, all in the name of God and love and Christian charity? It's absolutely shocking, and it's absolutely cruel, I think, the way they did it and the way the whole thing went down. So if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, feedback, if you want to talk to my sister Valerie, what the best way to do to get a hold of me is to just follow me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can send me a DM. You can send me a private message there. I'll respond to it. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so I can put you in touch with Valerie. I actually had a lot of people off the back of this episode way back in 2017 contact me, and I did put them in touch with Valerie. So if you have anything you want to discuss with her, let me know, and I'll put you in touch with her. Anyway, I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. We're going to have, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Dr. Josie McSkimming, followed by the Naked Pastor David Hayward. So look forward for those 2 episodes coming out here on Mindshift Podcast.